Hi, everyone. Hope you're well. Hope you're well. It sounds like a January snow, infested morning. Um, I'm not really keen on snow, to be honest, because of the mushiness that comes after, personally. But we thank God for the precipitation. Some people need this stuff. Cool. Hope you're all well. Uh, just to stress from the announcement about the fast, and also hi everybody online. Um, I think one of the easiest ways is in terms of following what's going on, is just download the app, the Every Nation app. It has all the information you need on there. I can see someone closing their eyes at the back. I need you to stay with me. Yeah. Okay. I know it's cold, but don't be a bear. Don't hibernate on me. Because what we're about to talk, what I'm going to talk about today, it's the start of a series, a pretty powerful one actually, called The Cross, which comes right after Christmas. It's almost like we're jumping straight from Christmas to Easter. We're not even stopping by, which reminds me of the weather. It's, going from, in 24 hours, going from full-on snow to rain, spring. Just copying what the weather is doing. But I wonder how your Christmas was. I hope it was happy, merry, joyful, good, whatever you needed. But ultimately, I hope it was peaceful and you sensed the peace of God in your life and your family. But one of the things that goes with Christmas is gifts. And if you remember, the series we did at Christmas was traditional Christmas. Gifts was one of the topics we talked about. In our family, a lot of people got gifts. I won't claim any credit for those gifts because I'm not really a gift kind of person at Christmas, but that's more toasting. But one of the gifts that some people got in our house was Tade got a chain. At the bottom of this chain, or the pendant, was a cross, which I guess today is cool to wear crosses. But if I were to walk around with a chain that had maybe a gas chamber truck on it, or a gun, some of the horrible things that happened in the U.S. In the last week. Imagine if someone walked around with a cyber truck as the pendant. Just sort of imagine what you think about that, or the electric chair, right? You'd say it's ghastly, it's horrible, disgusting. That's I guess, the emotion that will probably come out of you. I remember when I was growing up, the word cross and crucifix kind of were synonymous, because the cross points to the crucifixion, really, of Jesus. It's because of Jesus that the cross kind of looks cool today. It's a really ghastly, horrible thing. And it's not just me or, Christians that say this. If I were to read this quote to you, this is a quote by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was an elder statesman around the time of Caesar. In fact, he got in trouble for criticizing Caesar a lot. And this is what he said. He's a Roman citizen. He said, "It is a crime to put a Roman citizen in chains. It is an enormity to flog one, sheer murder to slay one. What, then, shall I say of crucifixion? It is impossible to find the word for such an abomination." So this cross that people carry around with them is actually a disgusting thing normally, where it starts from. It's not something you want anyone to die through. Even their worst enemies, you kind of have a bit of sympathy, If that's all you remember from this message, as we go through this week, at some point this week we'll do communion. That image alone is a message, and it's powerful enough to understand how much pain and suffering Jesus went through just because of us, just because of our sins. So that image should be imprinted on our hearts, that the cross was redeemed. We sang about redeemed today. The cross was redeemed. The image was redeemed because of Jesus' death. So in this series, we choose in Myland to go through 4 people, the experience as the witness Jesus being crucified. So that's what we want to look at. The first one today is the Roman Centurion who witnessed Jesus. In fact, he was in charge of the cross or the crucifixion when it was happening, when Jesus was there. So let's go to our text. There are two passages, pretty much in parallel, identical in some way. Matthew 27, 52 to 54, and Luke 23, 44 to 47. So Jesus had just been crucified in Matthew 27. So 52 reads, "And the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, 'Surely he was the Son of God.'" And Luke's account, Luke is the same bloke who wrote the Acts of the Apostles after Jesus had died and resurrected. So in verse 44 of chapter 23, "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn into two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, 'Surely this was a righteous man.'" You know, a Roman centurion, if you think about the name, centurion, century, it's 100. So he leads 100 people, 100 soldiers. Do you think that this business of crucifying people or crucifying Jesus, do you think it would have been something that he would have marveled at and be a bit strange on the day that Jesus died, given that this was what the Romans did to criminals? Or if you think about someone who's on death row and the person who's administering the injection, do you think the next guy who's going to die by lethal injection, do you think that the person in charge really would think it's special? Or yeah. So on the day Jesus was being crucified, I'm guessing that the centurion probably just thought this was another regular crucifixion. There's nothing special necessarily about this Jesus who's being crucified. Also, the whole preamble before this, which we'll get into, this is a Jewish guy being crucified. This is a Roman centurion with his soldiers. I don't really think there will be that much interest in this Jewish thing that has led to how Jesus got himself into trouble. So this wasn't that special. And also, the claims maybe that Jesus may have been special, there were other people who are also claiming all sorts of things. And we'll see a bit of that in the passage. So it would have been probably a sort of regular standard day for this guy. But then the things that happened at the very end that we read in Matthew in particular, the blitz, the thundering, the earthquake, that would have been dazzling and probably would have caught the attention of this guy. And that's, I think, the final ultimatum that led to this guy declaring that Jesus was the Son of God. But you could also ask the question, weren't there other people who didn't follow what the centurion did? Well, there were people who witnessed that crucifixion and didn't say what the centurion said. So let's not assume that just because this was glitzy and there was marvel around, that would lead someone to say, "Oh, actually, Jesus, Son of God." It's not. It doesn't necessarily follow. But if you think about what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 1:22, that the Jews are obsessed with signs because of the history, the prophecies. They need miracles, things to sort of connect you to God rescuing you or God showing up. That's what the Jews are obsessed with, those signs and wonders. Greeks, they look for wisdom, so knowledge. If I were to point back to my time at university, I would say that the Imperial College people that I went to university with were obsessed with intellectual assent. So everybody's looking for something that would convince them that God is God or whatever. I wonder what this Roman centurion was looking for. What was his own? What would have made him sort of respond properly to God? We could say at the very end that these amazing things may have been the reason, but maybe there were other things that happened before that. So let's try and go back to the text properly and see, with some context, what actually is going on. Before we do that, there are 4 people, as I said, that we're going to look at, Centurion being the first one. This actually reminds me of a book I read in university called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by a guy called Josh McDowell. It's more of an apologetics book, so it really helps you see the historical authenticity of the Bible and Jesus and that sort of thing. I think the book transformed my life, actually. But at the very end of this book were pages and pages of, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 lines of the most random list you could ever put together. So some people were astronauts, some people were lawyers, doctors, nurses, but all of them were professing Jesus. So to me, the 4 people we're looking at who were observing the crucifixion, it's like a tiny look back into what I feel like that book I read. It's almost like condensing the 100 and whatever 50 people I saw at the end of the book into these sort of 4. So let's go back to the text in detail. So let's go back all the way to verse 11 of that Matthew chapter. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor. So start to think like you're the Roman centurion observing this stuff. So meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor. The governor here is Pilate, yeah? So the Roman governor. And the governor asked him, Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? I mean, the Romans didn't really care much about the Jews, but the king of the Jews, that potentially is a problem in some sense, because who's got authority here? The Romans have authority here, not the Jews. So this king of the Jews business, are you the king of the Jews? You have said so, Jesus replied. Now, if you're a Roman centurion, what would you think of this Jesus guy saying, I'm the king of the Jews? You either just take it at face value and say, okay, well, it's a title, whatever that means, but who's in charge here? We are in charge. But why did Pilate actually ask Jesus this question with this term? Because, if you know this story well, the king of the Jews is not really, it doesn't feel spiritual at this point. Before this questioning that you see, there had been a trial already, a religious trial, where the main accusation was Jesus was basically claiming to be God, blasphemy. That's the main reason. But blasphemy doesn't equate to you deserving death. So the religious authorities had to come up with another thing that they think the Romans will be unhappy about. So that's why this has been sort of changed to the king of the Jews. But we'll come to that later. So Jesus said, you've said so. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you? They, not us, they. But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. If indeed you're king, maybe you should speak up and say something. Maybe we'll be able to get you out of this because we actually have authority over you. Now it was a governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd, or kind of like the U.S., but the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So Jesus was not necessarily a unique name, just another Jesus. Did you know this? Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. So if you are Pilate or any of the Roman guys, you're thinking, I'm sure there's a way out because this looks like injustice to us. So we'll try and argue this thing out. But at the same time, you're thinking, this Jesus guy, you should say something so that, maybe you'd help us make the case and, win this case and, free you. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: don't have anything to do with that innocent man. For I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. So even his wife was getting prodded that, listen, make sure that the outcome of this is just. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? So you would have known that this guy in front of you has all these terms coming through from the Jewish side of things. Pilate asked. They all answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. All the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium. Praetorium is basically the place where the Romans would gather in Jerusalem. Anywhere where it's not local to them, it's their sort of tent, their space, and gathered the whole army of soldiers around him. So it's a really Roman setup. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, as in King of the Jews, right? Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. Because when you're the boss, you can do whatever you want to do. So this is what authority looks like, right? They came to a place called Golgotha, which means a place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall. And after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Remember this bit. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. And above his head, they placed the written charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right hand and the other on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple. So they knew about some of these things that Jesus had said before. And build it in 3 days. Save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. So if you're going to destroy the temple and build it back up, they were referring to a physical temple. So again, this King of the Jews guy, you should have a bit more strength in you to do the things you claim you could do. In the same way, the chief priest, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusted God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, I am the Son of God. You see all these titles coming through. In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, so we're coming to the verses we read before, came all over the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. Eli, if you're even beating to a pulp, some of the things you say, when you put it together, the Eli sounds like Elijah. Makes sense. Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, not bottom to top. Remember that? The earth shook, the rock split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those who and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. So they'd seen a bunch of stuff. They've seen the trial all the way, and the dominant thing you hear through the verses we read was mocking, right? Because it's supposed to be the King of the Jews. Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. I think we sung some of this in the song earlier. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, his disciples, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. We would look at Joseph, I'm sure, in the series, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So these guys were aware. It's not like they didn't know. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he had been raised from the dead. This last deception, as in resurrection, will be worse than the first, as in the cross. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go, make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. So when you think about this, as I said before, Jews look for signs, Greeks look for wisdom. What might the centurion be looking for? When you consider all these things, I think my supposition is that if you're really righteous and you have power, you should have done something. You should have spoken up. You should have defended yourself. I mean, for crying out loud, if you think about a few years later, even Paul defended himself by saying, you guys essentially don't mess around with me because I'm a Roman citizen. You can't just, kind of, assault me, treat me whatever, and therefore I appeal to Caesar. Do something. Have a backbone, right? Don't just be this sort of quiet, timid, you're not really exonerating yourself kind of person. The fact is, what Jesus is displaying here is humility, meekness. He knew what the mission was, but you can see the contrast to what a normal person would do is what Jesus is doing. He's been humble, he's been meek. If you watch any of these sort of movies that depict the Roman times, words like strength and honor, these are the words that count, not humility. In fact, meekness was such a horrible, disgusting type word that it was Christ that actually made some of these words words of virtue. It's because of what happened with Jesus and the resurrection and the Christian movement that these words became cool. They were not. They were bad words. 300, all these big fights. It's all strength, honor, valor. Those are things that made sense. So what Jesus is doing here is completely different from what a normal human being that has power, king of the Jews, would have done. So it looks like this Roman guy, in my view, would have looked for authority, but the way Jesus and God the Father did this display of authority was not the way they would have expected. He did his authority display via stooping down to die for human beings and their sin. Greater love has no man but to lay down their life, which is completely different, weird, but very, very powerful. If you look hard enough, it's almost like you start with mockery, meekness, and then eventually you see this outworking of power that the Roman guy recognized, which is the earthquake, power. And it's like, oh my gosh, how have I missed all this stuff that was within Jesus, but he just didn't display it initially? So God, in a sense, confounded the wisdom of the Roman centurion because it was all there. Just because you didn't display it didn't mean that you didn't have it. And at that point, I think the awareness, self-awareness of the Roman centurion made him realize, actually, I got it all wrong in the first place. This person is really powerful because that's what we care about as Roman centurions, but he just didn't display it. I wonder what, if someone is still figuring God out and they're not a Christian, I wonder what God is using to confound you that you haven't really figured out yet. You haven't spotted it. He's probably doing that to you in some way, shape, or form. But let's be clear, this story is actually more of a Jewish story first before we start to see the Roman centurion's take on it. And this Jewish story has significance for all mankind, and that's why we're here today. And that's what we really need to dig into properly, because there are loads of gems in this passage. The most significant is what we read in verse 51, the tearing of the veil, the curtain from the top to the bottom. Why is it significant? So in the temple, not to get too much into specifics, this curtain separated two places, Holy of Holies and the Holy Place. And the point was that every year, the high priest will go into the Holy of Holies and basically make a sacrifice for the sins of Israel. There's a legend that, they would tie a rope to the high priest that goes in so that if he falls down dead, they're dead because he messed up. They wait to pull him out. It's actually known in the Bible. Just like there weren't three wise men. There are a lot of things, or the apple. There are a lot of things that people have sort of read into the stories, but that's a legend. There's no proof of that. But the point is that the high priest will go in and make sacrifice for the sins of the people. So with the curtain being torn from top to bottom, not bottom to top, right? Because you could have done that yourself. It is a demonstration, a symbolic gesture that I, God, I am opening up access for anyone to come to me and do this sacrifice thing because of what's happened down all the way there at Calvary. So that's the link. What's even surprising here is that Matthew didn't really make that big a deal of this stuff. And you find many passages like this in the scripture, actually, including this one, where the guys who were writing this were not necessarily saying, and therefore you can see that this is what's happening here. And sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. But later on, we then realize, oh my gosh, that's what this picture was supposed to depict. The most significant part of this whole story is this curtain being split into two. That we have access to God directly as opposed to having to go through a high priest. Well, we go through Jesus, he's the high priest. You can see the link there. But let's go through some of the terms that we've seen through this text. I guess the Jewish part of this, the spiritual side of this. It requires someone to be special to be able to do away with what the Jews had been accustomed to all this while, with the curtain and the high priest. So this person had to be special. So the question then is, how special was Jesus? Because if he's not special enough, then it's just another guy who died and there was coincidence with all this thing that happened. I think the first thing is this term, Son of God. I think anyone would realize that there is some sort of divinity attached to this title. It's not a Son of God, it's the Son of God. And you see this peppered all over the place. So regardless of how you interpret, come to the understanding of the Trinity, that's not the topic for today. Let's stick with the term divine, right? Godlike or God. This term, Son of God, people recognize this, that there was something divine about this character of Jesus. And you can see it through the text. The other point is, before this, Jesus, in other passages, had used this term, which to us may not sound that big a deal, the Son of Man. That's even more problematic than Son of God. It's more problematic because this verse, or this term, comes from Daniel 7. And the Jews understood and recognized that this, and Jesus made a claim to this, that this Son of Man reference in Daniel 7 was the coming Messiah who's coming through the clouds and coming to save, and his dominion will reign forever. That's only God. So when Jesus used that Son of Man term, he was making it even worse for himself, and that's what led to the initial trial in Sanhedrin, which is the local court, by the religious guys. So there was enough, I'm divine, that's coming through here, even before this text. Then that King of the Jews one, which is again linked to this Messiah rescuing you from your sin point. Just to give you a bit of culture and history here. So the Romans have jurisdiction over the empire, right? But they allowed local customs to flourish if you want too much of a problem for them. So Jews were allowed to practice their customs as long as they didn't, cause problems for the Romans. But if you start messing around with the Roman authorities, that's when they really will come and stamp you out. But they allowed the Jews to sort of do what they wanted to do. I guess maybe I should ask you guys a question. Who was the king at this time? Does anyone know who was the king? Herod, yes. So remember that when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there was King Herod, right? That was King Herod the Great. That was the first proper big guy. Now, the Jews didn't really have kings at this point. It wasn't the Jews that actually appointed this Herod guy. It was the Romans that, sort of similar to what the Brits did when they were going around the world, get a local guy who people hate to rule them. That's basically, it was divide and conquer. So that King Herod was the official imposed Roman king. But he actually wasn't. The Herods were not pure Jewish people. They were sort of a mongrel breed or whatever. That's where the Jews saw them. It's kind of like how the Jews saw the Samaritans, like you're not fully blooded Jews. So that was who the king was. And as I said before, Matthew didn't record in detail the conversation with Herod, because actually happened. So what happened here was the Roman Pilate conversations happened. Then, if you read Luke, he sent Jesus and these elders to Herod because, like, look, you have jurisdiction over this nonsense, this Jewish thing. Herod was like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see this Jesus guy. I've heard about him, because he hadn't met Jesus at that point. Then Jesus came to him. Jesus didn't say anything, was exactly like this. And Herod was like, this fool kind of guy. Send him back to, because Herod didn't have the power to say they should kill him, right? So he had to send him back to Pilate. That's actually what happened in the full context of the story. So the king of the Jews, in Jewish term, really, forget Herod. Herod's not really a real king from the Jewish point of view. The real king was the Messiah coming. This is Daniel 7 person. And Jesus is essentially claiming to be that one, not the fake Herod guy. So it's almost like you're causing more trouble for yourself the more you keep claiming this divinity thing. And then you see the claims about resurrection. I will build this out. But let's land this on one final one. You remember Eli, lema sabachthani? Can you guys open your Bibles on your Apple or your physical Bible to Psalm 22? So Psalm 22, verse 1. Do you guys notice something there? Do you guys see that? So Jesus did this a lot. Now, Matthew didn't make it explicit and say, oh, and this is Psalm 22 that Jesus is quoting. This chapter, Psalm 22, if you read it properly and you get through some of these verses, you will see a parallel, almost copy and paste, with what's happening right there that day with the death of Jesus, including the casting of lots for my clothes. So Jesus is kind of pointing to, I'm again the Messiah. This is a messianic prophecy about me. I mean, later on, people discovered this, but this is Jesus doing the same thing he's done with Daniel 7, Isaiah, whatever. Even whilst he's dying, he's still referencing this, so I'm the Messiah person. So any of the Jewish scribes would have figured out that he's doing it again. He definitely deserves the death. Now, if you look at verses 1 to 2 properly, you will see this exclamation that, God, you've forsaken me. Why is this synonymous with what's going on the cross? It's because of this sin thing, the rejection. It's like God looking away, God the Father looking away from Jesus because of the sin of the world. That's the correct interpretation when you go from Psalm to what's happening in Matthew and Luke. In fact, we read from verse 11, right? If you had read from Matthew 23 verse 1, is it 23? I think it's 23. Verse 1, 27, sorry. Verse 1 to 10, you will see the description about what happened with Judas and him and the 30 pieces of silver, and he threw it back at the elders because he felt so guilty. And they were like, please, we don't have anything to do with that blood money. That's your problem. And what eventually happened was that money was used to buy some plots of land somewhere that was called I think, I can't remember the exact time, but something to do with blood. And foreigners were buried, But the way Matthew went into detail about this, it's almost like I'm trying to let you guys see that this thing connects to the Old Testament because there was a prophecy about that too. So the whole thing's littered with, he's Jesus, he's the Messiah, he's the Messiah. After all this evidence, I think you would assume that, people should believe that Jesus is the Messiah and they should be all hunky-dory, whatever. But we know that that's not the case. I mean, the second thief, we don't see this in Matthew, but in Luke, you see that the other thief actually essentially becomes a Christian or gives his life to Jesus, whatever, right? On the cross, the centurion may have exclaimed what he exclaimed, but other people did not. Some people didn't. The religious leaders clearly were not impressed by any of this stuff, even though they should know better because of the references to the scripture. Why is it significant? Sometimes God's narrative and the stories don't fit with what we expect or our self-righteousness. the way we expect God to show up. Like what happened with initially with the Roman centurion. It was expecting strength, valor, defending yourself, but it didn't. God didn't really fit that well. So if you're someone who hasn't really fully given your life over to Jesus, I think you should ask yourself, am I walking my own narrative? Am I being stubborn, refusing the evidence and the stories as a lineup? Because that's essentially what the Bible is challenging that one is doing, if one is doing that. I saw a reel over Christmas. A Jewish Christian was speaking to on the streets in Jerusalem. He read a quote. I say quote because it was a quote. It reminds me of CM saying a Bible verse was a quote in Connect Group. I was like, that's the right word. Before you get all Christian, quote is a quote is a quote. So this guy read a quote, and the quote said something like, someone will die for some sins of mankind, and they'll be rescued from their ills, blah, blah, blah. And the Jewish Christian asked, the people who were speaking to were Orthodox Jews. But it wasn't just one group. There were several groups, right, different times. And he asked them, where do you think this quote comes from? I would ask you, where do you guys think the quote comes from? Okay, I made whatever I said up, right, sort of, right? Where do you think that sort of quote would have come from? Either New Testament or Old Testament. Yeah, so from the Bible. Where do you think that sort of quote would have come from? Anyone? No? Okay. So, yeah. So the Orthodox Jewish guy said, yeah, we recognize this. This is what the Christians say. Because they actually described the gospel and said, because Christians say Jesus came, as a lamb that was sacrificed, da, 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 da. So when they finished, he then said, this is actually from the Old Testament. So you don't even know your Old Testament. This quote is an Isaiah, it's probably Isaiah. Very, very messianic. So it's okay to pretend that the data doesn't line up, but when you remove the direct link and you get people to actually examine what's in front of them, the prejudices show up. Oh, this must be what the Christians put in the New Testament. But it's your text. And then the question then is, what do you then do when that truth is being put in your face? That's the question that every human being has to live with. So there are many reasons why people tend to want to hold back from making decisions about doing what the centurion did. I'll just go into a couple of reasons. So some people say, oh, these are accounts, they're not accurate enough. Some people say some bits of it were changed and doctored. I think the first thing to say is that the way these guys wrote this stuff, first of all, they didn't glorify themselves. Everybody wrote things in a way that made themselves look weak and small, and Jesus was exalted, all that stuff. But they also wrote like normal people, describing things that you don't have to describe in detail. Like, this is how people tend to write things. But also, they died for what they wrote down, which is a bit strange if you know that you concocted the stuff. And then people say things like, oh, yeah, some parts were changed. I think, for me, this is one of the laziest responses. Which part was changed? Because you were there, right? Just pick the part that was changed so that we know the bits that you're referring to. But nobody ever points to which part they thought was changed. I mean, to me, it's a very lame, silly. Go for bigger challenges, not some sort of, oh, this bit was changed. Well, which bit? I think the final thing I say on that is that people who actually went to school, studied, have PhDs, by and large, the scholars, the guys who actually look at this stuff, they generally conclude that it's actually a pretty decent historical document. So you who, are working in sales or marketing, you're not the one who's qualified to actually make the judgment. Listen to what the guys who spend their lives 4, 5, 10, 15 years say. And not all of them believe in Jesus, but they agree that actually the historical authenticity is legit. Some people will quote unfairness. Is there enough in this story to convince a Jew? Is there enough in this story to convince a Gentile about God's divinity or Jesus' divinity? I think what I'll just say to this one is, go and read Matthew 21 to 16. This is the parable of the laborers and the landowner. Because there's almost a disease, a symptom where someone does let me try and figure out what's going to happen with other people before I worry about myself. Putting on their life jacket before I put on mine. The parable of the laborers, I think in today's interpretation, you can say it's a parable of the contracts. you signed a contract at 10 a.m., 12 p.m., 1 p.m., and 2 p.m. And by 3 p.m., you all got paid. You got paid the same amount. The question is, what contract did you sign? You are not the person who is paying. You're the person who signed the contract, agreeing to the terms. So why are you complaining about the payout? I mean, if we were God, if we were the landowners on this side who wrote the document, I think the response to someone questioning the contract, we will absolutely be furious with anyone who comes and challenges the contract, because you signed the contract. And you also don't know what additional knowledge God has about each individual person with the time you then sign the contract with them. So I think we sometimes get ourselves in a sort of twisted knot, thinking, putting ourselves in God's place. We shouldn't. We should stay in our place. And then the last thing I want to say is, some people will say, give me my own Centurion experience. I want my own specific conviction. Do this for me. Again, it's good to kind of listen to God's words and what Jesus said about this particular question. Two points. One, Jesus gave a parable about a Lazarus, not the one that was raised to life. Sorry, not a real Lazarus, and a rich man. And both of them, the rich man was a bad guy. The Lazarus guy was a poor, good guy. They went to heaven, Abraham's bosom, whatever. Anyway, so the rich man was now appealing that someone should be sent to earth to convince his family to follow God. And the response was, look, even if we send a dead person back, these guys will still not respond properly, because they've got it all figured out in their heads. So it's almost like you were not going to get 100% proof of anything. You get maybe 97, 98, 99%, but you still have to take a bit of a step of faith. I have an acquaintance, work acquaintance-ish guy, who I remember, this guy has spoken to, someone like N.T. Wright, who's a world authority on the New Testament properly, and he said, this guy said to me once, yeah, I would like my own Thomas experience. Do you see? He's saying, I want my own Centurion experience, my own Thomas experience, so that it's me. But, okay, what did Jesus say about that specific question? What Jesus said about that in John 20:29 was when Thomas himself said, after seeing Jesus, he wanted to look for the holes in Jesus' hands to believe. And Jesus said, blessed are those who haven't seen yet believe. Sorry, what more do you really need? Because again, if we were on this side, if we're on God's side, as in if we're God, I don't think we'll be that patient and tolerant. Because I'm God and you want me to be showing each of you specific, customized evidence. Can't you see the litany of evidence that I've provided for you to respond to me? That's not to say that over time you wouldn't grow in the knowledge of me, but just look at the cross. As I said, I think the Centurion switching was because this self-awareness that I mocked this king who didn't look like a king to me because he didn't do things the way I would, and then later realized, oh my gosh, I got it so wrong. I'm saying, if someone is here listening to me online, and you're saying God hasn't fit the mold yet, maybe you should think about and reflect about your life, and maybe read some scripture a bit more, because the challenge God is going to put to you when you see him is, I actually gave you a lot of signs. I actually did a lot of Centurion experiences for you, but you still felt that I should fit into your box. So it's on you. Or if you feel like I'm not yet at the cross, I'm still maybe on the road mocking him, maybe ask God, please lead me to the cross so I can see the wonder of your sacrifice. Maybe that's the prayer that's required. And if you're a Christian and you're following Jesus, and this all makes sense to you, I just want to put out a warning to all of us that there are times when we behave like the Pharisees regarding other things in our lives, where, if I were God, I would have done it this way. I would have made a case for myself. I would have done X, Y, Z. And I'm not saying those things to diminish some of the things that happen in our lives that are challenging, right? Especially this year when you look forward to the rest of the year. I was looking at some of the prayers and the things we prayed for last year. Many things happened the way we prayed for, but there are one or two things I'm like, goodness sakes, I can't believe this guy's in 2025 with me. Jesus, what's up? And I'm hoping and praying that this year will be the end to some of the, so there are things that we definitely have a crying out to God for. But my hope and prayer is that when we look at this guy's story, we see that actually there is a misconception of the broken, beaten up Jesus, his power concealed until the very end. And even the very end, he died. At that point, you could have asked the question again, I'm going to mock him even more. So a decision had to be made even by the Roman centurion to make that declaration. So I don't know where you are in your walk, whether you are someone who's seeking God earnestly. I want to encourage you to keep on seeking God. Because maybe you're on the road and you're not yet fully at the cross's feet. But I pray that God will lead you to that point where you'll be able to make that same declaration that Jesus is the Son of God. And you can see the significance of that death on that cross and the curtain being torn from top to bottom. And that if you're a Christian, you will look around you and think, are there areas of my life where maybe I'm behaving like a religious or over-religious person and putting God in some small boxes and I expect him to do more than, and I miss the significance of what he's saying or has said through his words. And maybe finally, to close with this, I just want to challenge us all. Let's make sure we read our Bibles more. Because in just this one chapter, there's a lot embedded in it. And sometimes I read some verses and I think, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this link here to that link to that verse. There's a lot there buried that the more you seek God, the more you actually see him revealed. As we reflect and sing this last song before service closes, remember what I said at the start. The Roman centurion expected that Jesus will defend himself, but instead he kept quiet. Whereas God, Jesus, displayed his authority through the grace that he made abundantly for everybody. That is the significance of the story. It's the tearing of that veil to open that place up to everybody so that you have access to God unfettered. So as we sing this last song, please think of this image of the cross, this redeeming thing that Jesus did, to take something so ghastly, so connected with horrible emotions. He redeemed it because of what he did by dying on the cross for us. That power, that decision, that grace does change everything. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for redeeming the cross, this horrible image in your time when you walked on this earth, such that many years later, many hundreds of years later, people can wear a cross, a necklace with a cross hanging around it as a pendant, and we think of what it means. We know that it's your grace. We know that it's because of what you did on the cross, the sin that you took away. God, I pray that every time we take communion going forward, that Lord, remember how horrible this death would have been and how you willingly chose to lay down your power and authority just because you wanted to redeem and reconcile us to you. Lord, I pray that we'll not take your sacrifice for granted. That same sacrifice that redeemed us, that shattered sin, is also powers available through it to fix many things in our lives. Yes, Lord, we recognize mysteries. Then not everything necessarily will be fixed. But the peace of God that passes all understanding, that comes from this selfless act that you did on the cross, Lord, I pray that it will stay with us today, tomorrow, and forever. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand.